your contributions online. I hope you all read each other's reflections. I thought they were quite insightful. I also found it very interesting to read what your goals are for the next 8 weeks in the class, and I just wanted to acknowledge those so that you all could kind of keep them in your mind as we go through each session, and pick up some of the trends that I read about in your goals. The one that was most popular, or the goals that people most wanted to get out of this, was to learn more about and from each other in the group, from your own experiences, your own professional backgrounds. Several of you said that was going to be one of your goals in the next 8 weeks, so we'll make a concerted effort to make sure that is possible. We also heard from someone that they wanted to learn about nonviolent action that is fighting for a view or an issue that they don't necessarily agree with, and how do they reconcile that. I think sometimes we think nonviolent action is always used for good. Maybe not in some people's opinions. A couple of folks were interested in gaining more of a historical perspective on civil resistance, and I think we've already done a little bit of that with the Force More Powerful documentary, and we'll spend more time today looking at that goal. One of you is interested in the training aspects of civil resistance, so maybe in your own work you'll take some of this and apply it in a training capacity. Also gaining tools for further research. One of you said that was one of your goals. And then also a couple of you said that they want to learn more about the conditions or motivations that spur people to wage civil resistance. And again, today we'll actually spend some time looking at that as well. And then there's also a goal for looking at emerging issues of nonviolent struggle and what's the next level of this phenomenon. And we'll be kind of building up to that towards our last session. And hopefully all of you will be developing your own insights on a lot of these questions as we go week to week. So it's great to hear your goals, and we will do our best as USIP and ICNC to make sure that you meet those goals in the next 8 weeks. So with that, I will hand it over to Mache. This is our agenda up here and our goals and objectives for today. And so we're going to kick it off with Mache to set the stage for our group work.
Right, and then we will divide you into 3 groups where we'll be discussing different tools to strategize for waging civil resistance based actually on the episodes that you had a chance to see for today. So without further ado, I will start. So my topic will be strategizing, mapping, and tactical choices in nonviolent resistance. And I thought that I will start from 2 quotes. Strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory, and tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. What do you think? Who said that?
The second one was Sun Tzu, because that was quoted last week.
Well, it wasn't Sun Tzu, actually. It's actually misattribution. I don't think you will find in his Art of War a book that kind of saying, and a number of people are thinking that this is coming from Sun Tzu, but it's not. And as far as I know, I cannot find the source from where it comes, but what it says is quite still smart and clever. And we'll be talking today about strategies and tactics. And I've got another quote, which this time comes from Sun Tzu. And just for those who might not be familiar with Sun Tzu, he is the Chinese war strategist who was writing his treatise in 4 centuries before Christ. And he was uncovered by the British military at the end of 19th century. And then if you go to all the military and war colleges today, you will see that it's studied quite vigorously by the military. But I thought that his insights are quite interesting also for those of us who are studying nonviolent conflict and how to wage nonviolent conflict. So Sun Tzu says, if your enemy is secure at all points, be prepared for him. If he is in superior strength, evade him. If your opponent is temperamental, seek to irritate him, pretend to be weak, that he may grow arrogant. If he is taking his ease, give him no rest. If his forces are united, separate them. And something that I found very interesting, if sovereign and subject are in accord, put division between them. Attack him where he is unprepared, appear where you are not expected. And in order to execute this, if we just take that for a moment to the field of civil resistance, in order to execute that kind of strategies that Sun Tzu is talking about, one needs to do a lot of planning and strategizing, and that's what we'll be talking today with you. I wanted also to quote Thomas Schelling, the piece of the Nobel Prize laureate in economics, who was writing about civil resistance. And he said, which I found also quite interesting, the tyrant and his subject are in somewhat symmetrical positions. And here, this is quite interesting statement, because if you, usually when you analyze the kind of power of civil resistance, of nonviolent movement, and the one that the nonviolent movement is trying to challenge, one usually talks about asymmetry of power. The side is weak, doesn't have the means to wage violent struggle, and the side that is trying to challenge is strong. So there's a lot of asymmetry. Also in the violent insurrections, we talk about asymmetrical power, and the violent insurrectionists are trying to address that asymmetry of power, well, by waging, for example, guerrilla war and guerrilla tactic in order to create the symmetry. Whereas Thomas Schelling was saying that actually that symmetry is already existing somehow between a tyrant and those subjects who are waging nonviolent struggle. And he says, and he explains, they can, meaning those who are challenging the tyrant in nonviolent way, they can deny him most of what he wants. They can, that is, if they have the discipline organization to refuse collaboration. And he can deny them just about everything they want. He can deny it by using the force at his command. And it is a bargaining situation in which either side, if adequately disciplined and organized, can deny most of what the other wants. And it remains to see who wins. What he is saying, in essence, it's almost that this is a game of chess. And it's and according to Schelling, the outcome is determined not by physical kind of power of the opponents, but by the skills. How smart one is in terms of strategizing and implementing various tactics to challenge the opponent. And in that sense, he thinks that there is certain symmetry in terms of waging the struggle against, for example, dictator. And again, that kind of quote brings our attention closer to the issue of tactics and strategies that are implemented by the movement. And the kind of intellectual guru of civil resistance studies, Gene Sharp, in his book From Dictatorship to Democracy, writes something that brings attention to the complexity of strategizing nonviolent resistance. And he says, the development of resistance strategy requires attention to many questions and tasks, both at the grand strategic level and at the level of the campaign strategy. All strategic planning requires that the resistance planners have a profound understanding of the entire conflict situation, including attention to physical, historical, governmental, military, cultural, social, political, psychological, economic, and international forces. This is what it requires in terms of the planning, the whole kind of mapping of the battlefield, which is very complex. And we'll be discussing today various tools that could be used in order to map the battlefield by the civil resistors. And since we talk about strategies and tactics, my question to you is, how do you understand strategy? What is strategy? What do you need to consider when you design or talk about the strategy? Any kind of strategy, whether it's a business, whether it's military, whether it's to wage civil resistance.
Today, I think strategy simply means a roadmap. You know, what you have to do to reach from point A to point B. What you need, maybe in terms of resources, you know, to move your objectives from point A to point B to achieve your goal.
Right. So you, okay.
I think you have to understand the context of the situation before you can develop any type of strategy. You have to know what you're facing, what all the factors are, at least that you can find out.
I mean, that's part of the strategy. Exactly. Yes.
An overall approach or methodology, and I think you could also consider it as the fulcrum.
Could you explain more?
In the sense that thinking about a fulcrum, where exactly are you going to place it? What pressure? What's your pressure points?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think in that way you could think about strategy as kind of the fulcrum that you're using.
Excellent. Excellent.
A framework within which one can apply tactics.
Exactly. Good. I think you mentioned all things that I have here on that slide. It could be the strategy could be understood as a comprehensive plan of action, where we need to look at the long-term goals, and you talked about that. But with the long-term goals, we also look at what results and outcomes eventually we want to see when we wage nonviolent struggle. So it's not only, perhaps, if we have a healthy type of resistance that strategize well, it's not only about, let's say, challenging a given oppression and getting rid of that oppression, but also what will come next after the oppressive regime is gone and we have to build society from the ground. Then how we should develop the whole struggle in terms of what kind of tactics to use and implement and when, the kind of sequencing of tactics. And naturally we need to look at our resources, what we have at our disposals, in order to then kind of weigh what is feasible on the part of the movement to do and what is not. And if it's not, how we can kind of annul that kind of weakness in order to still go ahead and implement the tactics that we would like to use. I've got, maybe you could give some examples of strategy. Concrete examples? Yeah.
Guerrilla work, for example? Guerrilla strategy?
That would be tactic, actually. I mean, you use the violent, tactic in order to challenge. I mean, the guerrilla war is a tactic rather than strategy.
Yeah, I would say it could be a strategy as well, if that is your main means towards the goal.
So let's see. So what is the purpose of using the violent, the guerrilla tactic?
So let's say it's using decentralized forces as the main strategy towards overthrowing a regime.
So then the strategy is overthrowing the regime.
The goal is overthrowing the regime. Strategy includes the main means towards that end.
We would then define that differently. So the violent action to overthrow the regime would be a tactic, and the overthrowing of the regime is the goal, which is the strategy in the way we define strategy. Any other examples? Let's see to get the kind of clearer picture of the strategy.
At first, I have to say so sorry because I can't speak English well, but I want to say I'm Iranian and I came here 5 years and 5 months ago, and I went there when we have a green movement in Iran, and we use some things for symbol for use. For example, we use some scarf green and some things that was green because we want to show to government that this is green movement, and this was a good way for showing our mobilism.
Fight. I would still see that as a tactic of.
It's a way for. It's a good way for achieve goal. It's a good way for. I think showing government that we are changed and we want to another thing.
I mean, that's definitely a very helpful tool to use in order to unite even the movement. But if we take the definition of the strategy that has overall goal, the question is what the green movement wanted to achieve by, for example, using the green color. And it could be a strategy, could be to unite the people. And we use the green color that is very appealing, that has religious roots, and that could be kind of uniting the people. So there was a tactic to use the green color, and the strategy would be, for example, to achieve greater unity of the movement.
Talking about strategy, I was thinking like the strategy of putting an end to apartheid in South Africa was a strategy for the Democratic United Front, and the tactic they used was boycotting the, let's say, white businesses and stuff like that. Does it make sense?
Yeah. The way they boycotted the white businesses, what exactly they do, that would be a tactic, whereas the whole strategy to undermine the anti-apartheid regime would be to implement the boycott. I mean, just to say the boycott is our strategy in order to, the boycott is used as a tactic, and the strategy would be to undermine the legitimacy of the anti-apartheid regime, for example. And that is very closely related to those strategies that I have here. We've got the first is ongoing conflict, nonviolent resistance by Western Saharans against the Moroccan forces. And the second one, it's kind of the struggle that ended successfully with the independence, proclamation of independence by East Timor. And the situation is quite similar in terms of ending the occupation. That was kind of the grand strategy, as we can call it. Then if you look at the specific strategy that was used and is used in Western Sahara, there were two. There is an emphasis that we cannot really be successful in waging nonviolent resistance unless we internationalize the nonviolent struggle, unless we develop coalitions and allies beyond our borders, usually with the governments or societies, that would then pressure Indonesian government or the Moroccan government to change the policies. And another strategy was to reach out to the population of the occupier. There was an acknowledgement that the regime that was implementing or that was behind the occupation of those regions sustained its power because there was a support, because it was enjoying the support of the population, of the society. So Western Saharans, and particularly Timorese, reach out, for example, to Indonesians, ordinary Indonesians, in order to win their support for their struggle. And that was the kind of general strategy. And then they implemented a number of tactics in both in order to internationalize the struggle or in order to win over the support of the local population. And those in terms of Indonesia and East Timor, a number of East Timorese students were studying in Jakarta. There was actually a policy of Indonesian government in order to assimilate East Timorese. Let's bring those East Timorese to study at our universities. But that was the step for East Timorese to reach out to Indonesian students. And they said, look, we look at the Sukarno government that is authoritarian and democratic, and we are suffering as much as we are suffering. So they were organizing various meetings, demonstrations together with Indonesian students to challenge Sukarno government. So the tactic they implemented was to reach out to Indonesian students, organize different types of open and less open challenges to the government, not so much to promote the independence or the idea of independence by East Timorese, but actually to promote human rights, to promote democratic changes inside of Indonesia. So I will stop here. We will talk about the strategy and tactics in groups, and then if we have more time, we will talk about the categories of tactics. Darren, would you like to distribute that now?
Yeah, definitely. So we have here a handout of 198 methods of nonviolent action, which some of you may be familiar with. Gene Sharp compiled these. Obviously, there are more that we could add to this since he wrote this back in the 70s. And, this is just a good resource to have to kind of elucidate the diversity of tactics that nonviolent movements have used throughout history. It's not just protests, street demonstrations. And are we ready to break up into groups, or no?
I think so.
Yeah. 35 minutes is to wrap your heads around these strategic tools, discuss those questions with your group, and actually prepare a presentation for the rest of the class. So you're going to come back and actually educate the rest of us about what these strategic planning tools are and how they manifest themselves in the historical cases that you watched in the A Force More Powerful documentary. And so the tool we're looking at is something called the Spectrum of Allies. And I'm wondering if anyone has ever used or heard of this strategic planning tool before.
What about an internal strength?
It
Would you
also
say-
had internal strength because one of the internal strengths is they were able to mobilize a large number of people to participate in the boycott because they had organizers.
Bureaucrats.
Yeah.
Has there been anyone in the
So they would probably be more
Sorry?
people that work for the state?
Yeah.
Yeah.
People that are in the state.
And on one side is people that totally agree with you, on the other side is the people that totally don't agree with you. And so who in this movement would be closer to your side and who would be farther from your side on the other side? And the ideas that we came up with by looking at the several different movements from the videos is that whoever is initially placed anywhere along the spectrum may not always be in that exact spot throughout the entire course of the struggle. Depending on who you interact with, who you engage with, who you convince, you may be able to move some of these folks over to your side. And again, depending on what actions or activities are taking place on your side, particularly by a violent group who might agree with you, you might actually move some of these folks away from your side, depending on what actions they take in terms of violence. So we have several different colors here representing the different case scenarios. Yellow is the Chile movement. And so in that context, we had MIR, which I don't know what that acronym is because I didn't watch the Chile segment yet. We had the miners' unions basically on the side of the movement. Then we had the Catholic Church kind of...
They were the violent communists.
MIR is violent communists. Okay, so they're the ones you kind of want to know.
Although it was peace in Russia, they were quite loud.
Okay. All right. And so then you have the miners' union on your side. Then you have the Catholic Church, which is kind of on your side, but, you know, kind of taking a less active role. You had Democratic political parties in a coalition, again, kind of leaning towards you, but not completely taking a very strong position. Middle class, who's like, well, what's going on? Why are you bugging me? U.S. government, which is coming in from the outside and helping bomb Allende. Then you had the junta, which basically is the one who took power. And then you had Pinochet all the way on the left, who killed off the junta, pissed off the U.S., annoyed the middle class, pissed off the coalitions, and eventually all these people moved over to this side and kicked Pinochet out. Orange is Nashville, Tennessee. And so on the side of the movement, you have the Southern activists. Then you also have the black college students who took an active role. And then you have the black lawyers who got involved medium on, whatever that means, later on when they started realizing that there were issues that they believed in that were a part of this whole process. And then you have the northern activists who came down to help, but some of them had to be convinced. Mainstream churchgoers who kind of in the middle, like, don't rock the boat, why you piss me off. White lawyers who may have opposed it initially, but then once they realized the law was on the side of the movement, decided that they could be moved over. White college students, store owners who initially were like, why are you messing up my store, why are you boycotting me? But then they realized once they got on the side of the movement, they would still get business, so they moved over. Average white person who probably didn't really care except on occasion when they wanted to beat somebody up. And then the mayor who they were eventually able to convince, and the police who probably were the hardest to convince over the long term. Let's see, and then green was...
Jeremy, I've got a question.
Sure.
So looking at the Nashville segment,
Mhm.
in the kind of the historical sequence of how they decided to mobilize people or kind of bring people more to the side of the movement, where did they begin? This is almost a rhetorical question, but like you have the mayor all the way over there on the end, but of course at the end of the segment you have the mayor saying, you know, I agree that it's not right to discriminate against somebody. So maybe how can a movement use this layout to determine who they target first to mobilize and bring more to their side?
That's a great question. And the way I would suggest this, although we didn't really talk about this completely, so if anybody in my group disagrees, please let me know, is that you would target the people closest to you initially to try to bring in the critical mass as much as you can and build it as you go across. Now, if you initially start off talking to the mayor without having done anything and without having gotten anybody on your side, chances are the mayor is going to say what he said in the beginning of the episode, which is rule of law stands, stop breaking the law. But if you get this critical mass moving over until you have the store owners on your side, and then you come into the mayor and after you're doing this huge protest, and you just ask him, hey, look, all these people agree with us. What's the problem? Then the mayor who wants to get elected again is going to say, there's no problem, you all for your votes. So that would be the way I would do it. But does anybody think of a different way or a better way? No? Oh, yeah.
I just want to make a comment. I mean, I think even in a more pragmatic sense, every movement has limited resources, time, and money, human resources and financial resources. And if you want to grow the movement, you usually start out with small amounts of people and money, and it's easier and more practical to get people in the next closest to you so that eventually you can use more resources to target those further away.
Absolutely.
So even just practically speaking, in terms of time, money, it's easier to start with the allies that are kind of at your reach.
But one more thing, sometimes you've got cases where the movement prepared the ground for the loyalty shifts by reaching, for example, to military or security forces that are aligned with the dictator, and they were doing that much earlier before the protest or mobilization occurred. So when you analyze, for example, Orange Revolution, Orange Movement, some of the leaders reach out to security and military forces a year or so before the demonstrations in the tent city on the square. So you've got examples where before things were mobilized, you had some kind of outreach done by the members of the movement to some pillars of support of the regime before they accumulated the strength. The question is that probably they wouldn't be able to shift that loyalties at that time without later mobilizing the people and going on the streets, but they opened the channels of communication. That was much easier than to bring the military and security on their side.
Very good.
But were those channels to, sympathetic elements within the military, or were they?
Those elements were, hesitant. In other words, they were aligned at that time with the regime, but they said that they wanted to keep all the options possible somehow. That's why they were open to meet with some of those leaders of the movement.
Where would they be, like, at the second one over?
Well, they were probably in the second right, like somewhere there. So, but the movement really was probably not yet mobilized. The middle class, was still kind of dormant, but still there was some kind of outreach going on.
All right. Should I go through the rest, or should we move on to another group?
Maybe we should move on to another group.
Cool.
But thanks, Jeremy. That was great.
Sure.
That was great. Which group would like to go next?
I can go, but I think we did it slightly different with regards to how the other group did it. We talked about the green movement in Iran and how it all started and what type of pillar of support that should be targeted, for future or whenever. So we first of all, we talked about the system of the Islamic Republic and that the dictator in Iran, he is the supreme leader who is in charge of many of the institutions, and directly he is in charge of the revolutionary guard that has more than 60%. That Iran's economy is almost 60% under this institution, and also that they are the supportive of the system. I mean, the Revolutionary Guard is created to support and maintain the Islamic system. That's their main goal. So we talked about the election in Iran, which was last year, and then there were a struggle amongst the reformers and those conservatives who supported Ahmadinejad, and they say more than 40 million voted, and then it's believed that Ahmadinejad, he stole the votes and then he declared himself as the winner, while the opposition said that it was, totally fraud. So what we discussed was that suddenly after the election, people came out. I mean, those who were the supportive of the reformers, they came out and they did protests on the street. So I would say that it was maybe a more spontaneous reaction to an election outcome rather than a solid and very profound movement that had like roots for several of years and that also was organized for many years. I would say it was very like spontaneous, and then it targeted maybe some of these pillars that are under the supreme leader of Iran. Mostly, I would say, since the election was done under the Interior Ministry, I mean, they were in charge of the election, and the government of Ahmadinejad, they were in charge of the Interior Ministry. I would say that the main target or the strategy or the tactics or whatever you would call that, it was targeted against the, I would say, Interior Ministry and the outcome of the election. So, and then finally the time ran out and we didn't discuss more.
So which pillars of support do you think were weakened?
Sorry, what?
Were there any pillars of support that were weakened by the Green Movement?
I would say Iran has a very complex system, but the authority and scarcity of the supreme leader as the person who is God's messenger and a divine person who sits on top of the system, I think that holiness broke and people dare to express themselves without being afraid. You know what I'm saying? So maybe that institution of supreme leader, who is probably in charge of the Basij and the Revolutionary Guard, and he is in charge of the media, and also he appoints 6 of the 12 judiciary members of the judiciary department. So I would say that his legitimacy was mostly targeted and questioned, and also he supported Ahmadinejad as his.
We are pointing out that, and rightly so, that the religious institutions pillar was actually divided. I mean, it's one of the reasons why his legitimacy and authority as a supreme leader is questioned, was that because there's a division inside the religious kind of establishment.
Yes, that too.
One of the pillars that was specifically mentioned, I think, was the state control of the media. There were stories of people and protesters and of the movement that were basically like leaked to the outside, that the state wouldn't have wanted to be in international news. And I think that while probably at this point the state has more controls over the media than they did before, it for the time during the movement and before they really were able to restrict all of the internet access and cell phone access, that for a while the pillar of the media was definitely weakened and targeted as well.
I just want to ask you whether, according to your assessment, you think that the fruits of that spontaneous, I would call it a spontaneous reaction, of the Iranian people, whether that can be harnessed, into a proficient and resilient non-violent movement in the future. Do you see that happening? To sustain the achievements so far made, even to threaten the powers of the rulership?
I mean, I'm not an expert on these issues, but what I can say is that since it was a spontaneous reaction, and of course it was non-violent people, they were peacefully marching and they were just demanding for a new election. I would say that they lost the momentum. However, the underground or the basis for a nonviolent struggle or basis for a nonviolent movement is being given birth to. So now you don't see a lot of like uprising or people on the street, but I think it's hidden because it's been repressed, but it's reorganizing itself right now. So even though they didn't get what they wanted, which was a new election, and Ahmadinejad is now the president of that country, but somehow it strengthened the confidence and also a long-term strategy of nonviolence for future opportunities.
Tron?
This is more like a question, because knowing, or I'm also not an expert on Iran, but I have the impression that there is also some sort of split between the president, Ahmadinejad, and the religious leadership, Ayatollah Khamenei, and the others. So would it be as interesting maybe to have two charts like that? Like have the pillars of support for the Ayatollahs on one hand, and for Ahmadinejad on the other hand, and then even analyze if some pillars have moved from the one to the other, or if they are split. Would that give a better picture of the actual situation, do you think?
That was actually quite interesting. I think that's the growing concerns for the regime, that within the conservative, within the pillars of power that controls Iran, the supreme leader and his machine, and then also the presidency and the government, who is under supreme leader, and they should be under him. But since Ahmadinejad is growing more and more, he is listening less and less to the supreme leader. That's very interesting aspect of analyzing the situation and see the different pillars that Ahmadinejad might have created, and also the supreme leader and the split amongst them and like that. Yeah, that's very interesting.
And we don't need to go into too much details about the Iran case, because we will have an expert on Iran coming and speaking with you in November.
Next Tuesday.
Is it already next Tuesday?
So
when we'll be talking about the third parties and diasporas, so we'll have a person who is working, an Iranian who is working with Iranians inside of Iran. So he will be then presenting, I think, much more elaborate picture of what's going on there.
I mean, in terms of this tool, not to go in detail about Iran, but I was just thinking about the crackdown on new media that occurred. You could say that the media pillar was starting to erode, and then the government responded very aggressively to sort of, I guess, re-support it. So in that situation, what would the response be? What would the...
I think that media, when you have the pillars of support, you talk about the state-owned media, and I think state-owned media were not undermined. They existed. What happened was that there was an alternative pillar built to support the movement through the social networking online. And this alternative institutional building was then captured by the state, or at least the state tried to capture, to a certain extent successfully, but not completely. So it's not that they really challenged the existing pillars of support in terms of media, because I think that they didn't took the state-owned media on the side, which started suddenly beaming the the pictures and information about the movement, what they did, they would build alternative media for themselves.
But the legitimacy of the media, right? I mean, wasn't the legitimacy of the state media
I don't know, what was the perception? I mean, did media lost? I mean, did media lose anything on because of the challenge of the Green Movement?
I think media very helps to green movement, but unfortunately media under the leader in Iran, and it's controlled, and we don't have internet, we don't have anything, and actually unfortunately TV, radio and all of newspaper are for government.
And just to add to what she said, they lost some of the legitimacy because some of the major Iranian let's say figures like pop artists or musicians, they said, you know, from now on you're not allowed to air any of my work on the state channel, which was a big punch in the face because this, I mean, the one of them, which is Shahram Nazeri, he said none of my work should be aired, and he is a huge deal in Iran. He's a big deal in Iran, and that was a punch in their face. I think somehow their legitimacy has been undermined.
One thing that we that helped to us was cell phone, because all people take photo and take a movie and they send to each other, and this way was very good for sending and understanding that what happened in Iran. Justice. This was a good media for us.
So I'll just make one kind of concluding remark before I move on to the last group. But what I learned from these two presentations is that I've seen a connection between this strategic planning tool, the Spectrum of Allies, and the Pillars of Support strategic planning tool that I haven't necessarily connected before, which is, you know, over here Jeremy was talking about, you know, you've got your allies, your active allies, maybe your passive neutrals, but then on the other side of the spectrum you've got your hostile neutrals, active opponents, and I really see that side of the spectrum showing up in this strategic planning tool. Like, who are the groups and institutions that are actively propping up your adversary, the power structure or the regime that you're trying to challenge? And so they've obviously listed that very well here in looking at the Iran case. And so after you've been able to, you know, mobilize or create a lot more allies for your movement, then you can then analyze your adversary, all those who may be hostile neutrals or active opponents, and start breaking them down by those pillars, and then dissecting each of those pillars. You know, so okay, there may be some people in the media that, okay, they're delivering the government message, but we know from our sources that there's some who would like to maybe provide an alternative perspective. Or there are those in the besieged who, you know, they're brother of one of the members in the movement. And so how can we use that to start chipping away at that pillar that is propping up this regime? So that's a good connection that I saw between these two. Okay, last group.
Hello. We looked at the SWOT analysis. Everyone should have a copy of it. We kind of see it as a roadmap, as the initial step when your organization plans on doing a nonviolent movement. Step by step, you all can read, but looking at your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and kind of moving through this to see where you might need to improve, what you have going for you, and making judgment calls based on that. Johanna wants to go in a little bit more depth on these, or should you want me to?
Good.
Okay. We're hoping to look at all the cases, but we just did South Africa. We got really happy with South Africa. We came up with a lot of strengths, which were based on the opportunities that they had. International solidarity, strong party and coalition with the ANC and the UDF, the international corporations leaving and the economic sanctions being imposed on the government, which was definitely an opportunity that became a strength. Blacks were the majority in South Africa, so they were the major consumers. White dependence on black buying power, which ties in with that. The training and support of activists by other countries, going to Uganda, we also talked about a trip to Vietnam by the ANC. Some of the things that we saw kind of as strengths, but they could be taken as threats or opportunities depending on the situation. Most of it turned out really well for South Africa, but had something gone wrong, it could be an external threat. Youth leadership, connection to a charismatic leader, the collective ownership of the movement, diffuse leadership. We saw these as kind of threats because if something happens to your charismatic leader, or the diffuse leadership, you risk the possibility of the collapse of the movement if it falls into violence. Some of our strengths, but with external negative threats, was the use of arts and culture, resilience and unity, and the adoption of knowledge and limitations. Our weaknesses and external negative threats, use of violence when some of their leaders were arrested, violent repression, temptation to buy gifts at Christmas time, fracture among ethnic groups that could happen, and the lack of financial resources. And some of the opportunities that could have been weaknesses, martial law, it was an opportunity because you had outside governments noticing the repression, but it was an internal weakness because you had people getting arrested and it could splinter the movement. And also Desmond Tutu. You want to explain the Desmond Tutu a little bit more?
Sure. The role of moral authority, religious leadership, and them pointed out that was both the connection to the Anglican Church outside of South Africa, but we also discussed the relationship between South Africa's as the Christian orientation of many South Africans and the relationship to the moral authority that Desmond Tutu provided, or his leadership, religious leadership.
I have a question about the strength and threats of the use of arts and culture.
And Johanna, you thought?
Sure. So one way that arts and culture was used as a strength in relation even to threat is that oftentimes there was this violent repression, there was all these, especially young people, being killed, and so when you had these funerals, because of the strong kind of use of arts and culture, people were singing, and that was both helping people to heal, which built resilience, and also to build solidarity among the people and help the people to come together, even in a very kind of brutal and sad situation.
So how would that not be like an opportunity to bring people to bring the movement together? Like, why would that be part of the threat?
Because you're risking the threat of the outside oppression even more, having more people be arrested and doing more damage to the community, which could possibly damage the movement as well. I guess it would be one of those on the line.
Maybe the question could be that indeed there was a threat in terms of being attacked by and oppressed, but why eventually then became an opportunity. And then that would be the question to you, given the fact that indeed there was an illustration of the strength, but at the same time the existing threat, eventually those funeral demonstrations became an opportunity, not a threat. Yeah. And then one would need to analyze why that was the case.
I think like some of the other models that these things can migrate over time. And so I would say that it's in the lower right-hand corner at the end of the movement, and that it's both an opportunity and a strength.
I've been using this model a number of times when it comes to organizational development in particular, and a part of it which I find very, very crucial, and which is also in the handout, is the sentence saying that strength and weaknesses are internal factors, opportunities and threats are external factors. And I'm a little bit confused because it seemed like in your presentation, and I can't read the notes from here, but it seemed that you mixed them a little bit. And my experience is that also when you later on try to design actions and activity based on the SWOT analysis, it's very important to be stringent with what is internal to the organization or movement you're analyzing and what are the external things, so that things can migrate between threats and opportunities and between strengths and weaknesses, but they cannot migrate between, for example, a strength and an opportunity, because then they go from being internal to external, and that's difficult to do at the same time.
Because as at least in my experience and maybe the collective group, this was the first time working with the model, so maybe that's where some of our
I think
problems
our
come from.
sort of analysis is more from a historical perspective than sort of building a movement. And I don't know, I can see something move like the music move from an internal strength that's not familiar to the external world and become later an opportunity that's external and that motivates external communities to support the movement. So I think there could conceivably be a migration.
Over time?
Yeah.
Yes. While one thing like art and music can be a threat and an opportunity at the same time.
Right.
It's difficult to be internal and external at the same time.
Right.
That will be
Yeah,
to be over time.
I would agree with you.
Yeah.
Great, thank you very much to all groups for presenting these different tools. It's 7:45 and we wanted to take just 5 minutes, since I know many groups probably didn't get an opportunity to get through all the questions that were in that sheet. But we thought the one question that we wanted to hear a little bit more from you about is what you see as being the potential strengths and weaknesses of these strategic planning tools. So you've got the spectrum of allies, you've got pillars of support, and you've got SWOT analysis. Okay, all tools to help you think strategically and analyze a conflict. So maybe let's just take 4 or 5 minutes, turn to the person or two people right next to you, and share with each other what you see as the potential strengths and weaknesses of using these tools. Are there any groups that would like to share with us what they see as some of the strengths or some of the weaknesses of these various tools? Essentially, what did you just talk about?
Yeah, we'll just discuss and say that, most of these models, work in different contexts. And to say that there tends to be out of stereotyping, where you think that a model that may work for Iran will also work for, a country in Africa. Because most of these models are based on assumptions. And these assumptions sometimes have to change depending on the circumstances and the context. Countries have different cultures, they have different settings. And therefore sometimes we may need to adjust, with the prevailing conditions in those particular settings to be able to get meaning out of these models. So if we generalize everything, then we don't get exactly the kind of things that we expect to get. So generally, models work differently because of different cultural settings, because of different environments, and so on and so forth.
Maybe this ties nicely with Jawar's critique of.
Yeah, right. Yeah, in our group, when we were doing the pillars of support, I actually showed the group an adaptation of that chart for Ethiopia, because he looked at that model and he said, this model can't apply to our movement. Our movement is multi-layered and very complex, like Trond made that point that even maybe sometimes 2 pillars are appropriate. And he actually, I can pass it around, he actually developed different adapted models to that made more sense for that movement. So these are only, let's say, starting points, but every movement adapts and adjusts, spectrum of allies and all these things. These are just more pictorial start points, but everyone with their own, it's like 198 tactics. it's now probably 300. So that pillars of support can have 5 or 6 adaptations. So it's true, every movement is different. And when ICNC talks with activists, we try to share with them, don't feel locked into this model. This model is only for you to think about creating your own model.
Actually, I want to apologize also because Vanessa, you weren't actually here last week,
Right.
so some of you
I
may not
introduced-
actually know who Vanessa is. So
I
maybe you
introduced
could
myself to
introduce-
group 2.
Yeah, maybe you could introduce yourself to everybody. Since
Yeah, I'm a colleague of Darren and Mache. I work at ICNC. I'm the Senior Director for Civic and Field Learning.
I guess we identified a weakness in these models as being the potential to sort of institutionalize, and that might be a negative. And also that particularly this model over here has a tremendous potential to create stereotypes, and get people stuck in stereotypes.
Could you give a specific example?
What was the example you used about the white lawyers versus black lawyers? You know,
Black students.
and black students versus white students, maybe.
right, we talked about that, and
Right.
I don't know if Jeremy or someone from our group could
Yeah.
maybe elucidate on that a bit.
Well, we actually, internal to the group, debated that quite a bit on do we want to divide them out or not, and then even in dividing them out, does that represent the whole mass of that group? And we decided no, but it represented the proportion of the mass that that group would be, so that we accepted that there's going to be caveats, but we were trying to represent the largest portion of it.
We thought about taking the 7 pillars or however many pillars there are and using them as a basis for some kind of force field analysis. Assign some values to each of the pillars and say if you've got 100 points, you're going to allocate them across the pillars, which are the strongest and which are the weakest, and within each point total in each pillar, how would you break that down into its core components, its inner components, and which of them are vulnerable and which of them aren't, and which are the ones that would take the least resources to attack or to co-opt or to...
We also talked about a strength as that these can be used as a basically methods of like engaging groups in collective analysis, and we talked about the possibility of using images rather than words to do those things. One thing that we didn't talk about, but I thought about also as a weakness, is that none of these tools really allow for people to envision the kind of where they want to go. In terms of strategy, it's really important to think about where do you want to go.
Paula?
You know, I think the tools are very robust, but as she pointed out, you need to adjust this locally depending upon the local laws, regulations, and all the other stuff. But my issue has to do with a 4th tool, if you will. You know, and that has to do with what happens the day after. You have removed a regime. I mean, the people have removed a regime. What happens the next day, the next week, in terms of that? If you look at the history of World War II, before Marshall allowed the troops to go in or do anything, he asked for and received what is known famously as Appendix D. That precisely said, in elaborate details, how the administration will be carried out and who will do what immediately after the shots are over and there is no war. If you look at Georgia, if you look at Kiev, one of the fundamental things that has happened, in my view at least, is that the day after there was no plan whatsoever. The group almost disintegrated. It happened in the Philippines too, in terms of that. So in terms of, say, you have, looking at mobilization, you have look at political support, you have the other support. Assuming these all succeed and these are working out, and assuming also that there can be, you know, many mistakes after, you know, taking over. But in order to do what needs to be done afterwards, is there a tool? Is there something that we need? Is there something missing? I'm not sure at this time.
Well, let's leave it at that. I hate to cut you off, but I encourage those of you who still have your hands raised to take this online.